Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Oliver Rosales. I'm a professor of history at Berkshire College. I'm so happy to welcome Jennifer Robin. I will formally introduce her in just a moment, but I'll say that yes, please use the chat as this webinar is going on. If you have a question for the speaker, you can post that in the Q&A. Jennifer was kind enough to share the article. I think, send it out to the BC listserv, but if you're interested in a copy, you can definitely let me know, and I'm sure she'd be happy to have you read it. I will say that this is the third and final installment of a lecture series I've been doing this year with support from Digital Ethnic Futures and the Mellon Foundation. We've had two speakers talk about themes related to migration and agriculture in the Central Valley, and so I'm super excited to have Jennifer here with us today to talk about her now award-winning article in the Pacific Historical Review. Before I again introduce the speaker, I will say the format for today, she's going to talk for maybe 30 minutes or so, depending on how long she wants to go. And again, along the way, if you have questions, you can drop those in the Q&A, and we will definitely moderate and field those in the Q&A portion. So yeah, this is always my favorite part of a webinar or a speaker event. So Jennifer Robin Terry is a social and cultural historian, a first-gen scholar, like many of our community college students, and the president of the Western Association of Women Historians. She holds degrees from Sacramento State University and a Ph.D. in American History from UC Berkeley, my alma mater. She has published articles on the White House Conference on Children and Youth, the internment of American children from expat families in the Philippines during World War II, and on child labor in the entertainment and agricultural industries. Her most recent article, Niños por la causa, Child Activists and the United Farm Worker Movement, 1965 to 1975, published last year in the Pacific Historical Review, won the 2024 Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Prize for the best article in any field written by a woman scholar. That article serves as the basis for today's talk. Again, thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today, and I will now turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rosales, for that very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. Let's see, get the screen share going. Okay, so I'm really happy to be here with you today, and I'm so excited to share my work on child activism and the United Farm Workers with all of you. Because the article just won an award, and UC Press, which is the parent company of Pacific Historical Review, they want people to read it. So this article is actually free for a limited time online. And so at the end of this presentation, I will give you a link, and you can link to the article that way, and you can read it. So this topic is really close to my heart because I grew up in the 1980s in the Pajaro Valley in Watsonville, California. Headquarters of Driscoll Strawberries and Martinelli's apple cider. Growing up there, I had friends who were child farm laborers, and my first job was working for an apricot farmer the summer that I turned 12. So my maternal grandmother, she was an Okie migrant laborer in the 1940s when she was just a teenager, and my husband's family were also farm laborers in the Pajaro Valley. So learning and writing about the history of child farm labor and the law has become a sort of labor of love for me as I seek to better understand where I and the people that I love have come from. So the subject that I present to you today, child activism within an agricultural context, is actually a bit of a tangent from my primary focus on child labor. And I'm excited to share with you how that tangent came about. So first, I'd like to start with a pitch for the history of childhood as a field of study, because if you're interested in social justice, the history of childhood offers a wealth of stories. I understand that some of you in the audience may be students, and perhaps you are considering majoring in history. So I'll just share that the history of childhood as a field is relatively young, and there is much to be explored. And if you're interested in learning more about the field, check out the Society for the History of Children and Youth's website, and you can just Google them. That's I've got it up there. So I came to the history of childhood while working on my master's thesis at Sacramento State over 20 years ago. At the time, I was doing research on an internment camp in the Philippines where the Japanese army had imprisoned civilians from allied nations. So the prisoners were expatriates and citizens of countries like America and England and Australia and China and many others who had joined the Allied cause to stand against Nazism and fascism in the 1940s. They were people who, for various reasons, were living in Manila and the surrounding area when the Japanese military invaded the Philippines in December of 1941. Now, the topic of Allied civilian internment abroad is rather obscure, but not totally unstudied. So one of the things that I had to do in order to justify why I wanted to write about the Santo Tomas internment camp was I needed to find an angle. And this is because the purpose of traditional history is knowledge creation. And so we're always looking for how do these sources tell us something new? And this will bring me around to my current article, I promise you. But these sources, we look for these sources that'll tell us something new, sometimes about a story that people know very well. So as I was working on this project, it occurred to me one day that children were actually my unique angle. And this is how I came to the history of childhood, because I realized that even though there were more than 1,000 children interned in this camp over a 3-year period, no scholar had ever written about them and never examined them, and what kind of influence, how children influence and shaped the internment experience. And children always make a difference because the very act of protecting and providing and caring for children necessarily alters and directs life rhythms. And because children are in this nascent stage, they're so young, they're just learning, they're taking everything in. The ways that children experience and interpret historical moments are also different from the ways that adults do. So in addition to this being my MA thesis, the project became my first published article, and the experience set me on my professional path that has focused on the history of childhood ever since. So if you're interested in learning more about the children of Santo Tomas internment camp, you'll find a link on my website, and I will give you my website at the end of the presentation as well. But my current project traces the history of child farm labor and revisions to the Fair Labor Standards Act since 1938. The thing that drew me to this topic was a little history pebble inside my brain. That pebble was the fact that and you have probably heard this, students, faculty, people, that pebble was that US history courses and textbooks often tout the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act as one that totally bans child labor. It's celebrated as a progressive era reform that finally came to fruition during FDR's New Deal. But being from an agricultural community where children sometimes missed weeks of school to work in the fields, that claim never quite sat right with me. So in my research into the federal law, I learned that many jobs that children do are not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, but that this is not necessarily a shortcoming of that law. Rather, it is because the Fair Labor Standards Act was an interstate commerce bill. It dealt with the flow of goods across state lines. It simply was not within Congress's constitutional jurisdiction to regulate employment that did not result in interstate goods or local service jobs or domestic labor. So while the law did ban child labor in mining, mills, and factory production, it did not apply to occupations like domestic work and retail sales. But what about agriculture, you ask? Don't fruits and vegetables and animal products get sold across state lines? And indeed they do. So what I also learned in my research is that in 1938, Congress compromised to get the bill passed. They exempted 2 powerful sectors from the child labor provision, 2 sectors that did produce for interstate commerce. And those 2 sectors were the motion picture industry and agriculture. I found this fascinating, and they are both topics that I am interested in, I have written about, I love to read about, but they're 2 totally different types of labor. And so I thought, well, what can I do with this? And so at first I tried to work both angles, farming and Hollywood. I tried to bring them together. I tried to bring these topics together into one project. And when I came across this picture of former child actor Shirley Temple Black with former child farm laborer Cesar Chavez, at the Commonwealth Club in 1984, I thought it was a sign that I was going to be able to do this. But the project just got too unwieldy. And so I published a little something on child actors with the intent to return to the project in the future, and decided to just focus on agriculture. So the project on agriculture, child activism, and the United Farm Workers. So that project on child labor, it brought me to the topic of child activism and the United Farm Workers. And it did so because, I'm sorry, I've lost my place. So this brought me to the topic of child activism in the United Farm Workers, which is the subject of the recent article that was published by the Pacific Historical Review and is the focus of this talk. In tracing the history of efforts to revise the Fair Labor Standards Act child labor provision through the 1960s, one of the things that I did was I looked into the UFW's position. Because in the 1960s, there was an effort to revise the Fair Labor Standards Act to bring child agricultural workers under more fully under that child labor provision. And so I thought, well, the UFW must have something to say about this. And that led me to the Ruther Library at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And that led me to this happy tangent that resulted in the article. So the Ruther Library holds many archival collections relevant to the UFW and farm labor history. If you're interested in doing some research, they do have a grant that they offer you can apply for. So this would be a great place to go if you want to do some research on the UFW. And much of this material was actually donated by the UFW. So they hold a lot of their records there in Michigan. So when I first arrived at the Ruther, I was basically just looking for references to child labor within adult generated content, just very focused on what can they tell me about child labor and the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1960s. So I looked for things like union memorandums and announcements and newspaper clippings, maybe letters to senators and things that would indicate the UFW's position and possibly their actions on the issue of child farm labor and legislative reform. So here are a few of the things that I found. The UFW did have a position, as you might imagine. Child labor depresses adult wages and also deprives children of valuable classroom time. It endangers their health. So the UFW took a very strong position. And these are just an example of some of the flyers that the UFW would pass out during boycotts and during strikes and public appearances. And also they would place these as advertisements in newspapers. And so you can see that the topic of child labor was very much something that the UFW thought needed to be addressed. So as I was, so these were great. And as I was looking further, I had a eureka moment. And the eureka moments are when historians know that they have stumbled upon gold. Okay, so those flyers and all of that, that was great. But they were just variations on materials that I had found elsewhere by other groups. So the eureka moment was found when I was looking at the UFW Office of the President's boxes, and there were several folders. This is a very large collection. There are a lot of boxes, basically papers of Cesar Chavez. And I found several folders filled with children's artwork and their letters and their handmade greeting cards, all addressed to Cesar Chavez. And this was amazing. I cannot stress enough how amazing this is, because documents that are produced by children are really rare archival finds. They are items that just aren't usually preserved long-term, right? Parents might hold on to them for a while, teachers might hold on to them for a while, but these are things that just don't even in families usually make it to, 50 years later. So the fact that Chavez and the UFW kept these items speak to their significance in terms of what they meant to Chavez and what they meant for the cause. The artwork, the letters, the greeting cards vividly express children's support for La Causa and their desire to connect with Cesar Chavez. Now, there were several different types of documents here. There were class letters that were written as a part of a lesson or in response to UFW speakers. So there were teachers, specifically high school, middle school teachers, who would assign books about farm labor or about activism in order to link the current events of the day and talk about the strikes and the boycotts. And so students would be assigned to write letters to Chavez. So those are interesting. You see a couple of those here, and they're fairly uniform. So there must have been some sort of model that the teacher gave, but then there's usually some comments kind of at the end that are a little more personal. There were also classroom letters from kids in elementary school. They were much more basic, but it's showing that this was a lesson. So the teachers are trying to teach about the strike. There were also times that people from the UFW would come and speak to classes. And so there would be a panel of speakers, and they would, the teachers would invite them. And so some of these letters were responses to those speakers, confirming who was there and what the children got out of that. So there were letters that were not a part of classroom collections, though, children who took it upon themselves to contact Chavez. And let me show you, let's see. So these are some of the classroom letters. So with the high school are here on the left of the screen. The students had read The Social Rebel, and they're reading That Man Cartwright. And so these are books that deal with farm labor and Mexican labor. And then over here on the right, these are middle school. And so these are kids that are talking about, I read what you're trying to do, and I support you. And I just love the children's voices. I am among the many who sympathize with the plight of the migrant workers. This demonstrates that the kids are taking this seriously, and they want to be taken seriously themselves. And in the background there, I have just an assortment of some of the elementary school letters that were written. And so, these are some letters from children they were just a little more personal. They were not done as a classroom assignment. So kids who would tell Chavez their age, at the age of 13, I hope I can help you. I've been a supporter of the strike for close to a year, and I think it is under wise leadership. So there was, a lot of this kind of praising Chavez for what he was doing, and saying that basically they want to lend their support. Over here on the right, there's a letter from when Chavez was in jail. And the little girl says, I felt pretty bad when you had to go to jail. And I am just 9 years old, and write to me, please. So, Chavez was a celebrity that these kids wanted to connect with. And so so just, and then I just like, kids writing, we are not going to buy the lettuce and grapes. And they do this in this little fancy way. So it's kind of fun. Here are, this is an example of those that are not a part of a classroom assignment. So we have stationery, we have handmade cards, children make birthday cards, Valentine's Day cards, Easter cards, Christmas cards. There were so many cards in some of them just hand drawn, some of them construction paper. With the thoughts of the children as they reached out, they try to connect with Chavez, and they want to let him know that they support. Some of these kids were involved in the boycotts. They were activists themselves, and some of them were just trying to let Chavez know that they appreciate what he was doing. Sometimes kids would send money with these letters, donating their allowance or prizes that they had won, or things like that, to the cause. So, and Chavez responded. So I just want to say that these items, they came from both children in farm worker communities and those who lived in cities as well. They came from California, and they also came from places like New York and Massachusetts and Boston. They came from parochial schools and public schools, and from children who were UFW members and their families were members, because children were allowed to join as well, and others who were just learning about the cause. And then in those files, there were duplicates of Chavez's responses to the children. And I was impressed that Chavez responded to these children in very kind and generous ways. He was, as you know, a very busy man. And while there were occasions when he had other people respond to the kids, I found some notes, some handwritten notes, where he just said, you know, please respond to this child. But for the most part, when he had time, he would sit down and type these out himself, or handwrite them and someone else would type them. But I found also there seemed to be a trend that the further we go into the 1970s, the less often Chavez was responding himself, for many reasons, his health, being in jail, things like that. But there were dozens of letters authored by Chavez. And here's an example. And his letters demonstrated an affinity for children, and they also showed that he made a concerted effort to cultivate children's support. Children would say, sometimes I don't know what I can do to help. And he would say, you know, there are a lot of things that you can do. And he would talk about there are other children who are involved, and they are making huelga flags, and they are telling their friends and their schoolmates and their parents not to buy lettuce, not to buy grapes and things in non-union. He would thank children for their cards that they made him. He would thank them for the Christmas presents. He would just always, he was very, very encouraging. Some of these children, oftentimes he would call them brother, call them sister, or manita. So there was this endearing kind of language that he would use. So for Chavez, no one was too young to understand and support la causa. And this is what I found through these documents that I would not have found anywhere else. I got a very personal look here, I felt, into the relationships that he cultivated to bring people into the cause. And he was very encouraging of children. He recognized the important role that children, both farm workers and non-farm workers, could play in the administration and publicity that was so necessary for la causa's progress. And after finding this cache of child-produced materials, I began to look for other sources that would help me flesh out the story of child activism related to the UFW. And as I write in the article, I found that children walked the boycott picket lines, they did clerical work for the union, they attended union meetings. There were boycott families that would travel and live in cities in the East, and the children would speak in front of their classrooms. They would sometimes whole families speak in front of gatherings, telling people about farm labor and what it is to labor, how that some of the policies or non-policies hurt these families, the reason why child labor was necessary to earn a family wage. And they would really, just enlighten people across the nation to why they should care, why they should support the boycott. So in addition to the documents, the letters, the handwritten cards, the archivist Deborah Rice at the Ruther provided me with folders of photographs of children who were engaged in field labor and UFW work. And so these photos are just absolutely amazing photos of kids who were on the picket lines. They were striking near the fields. They were boycotting Safeway. They're attending union meetings. And so these were just fabulous photos. I had never seen photos of the kids as a part of this movement. And now some of these may be online now. A lot of this is starting to kind of get out there. But these were very, very exciting. And I just knew I needed to do something with these photos. And so only one of the photos that are on the screen are available in the article. So there are several others that have never been published before that are in that article. So if you take a look at that, you'll see them. So these photographs provided visual proof that children were present and active in the UFW. And with these documents and photos, as well as with other corroborating UFW materials, I argue that children stood at the center of the social justice appeal as both agents and symbols for la causa. Their presence and participation reinforced Chavez's claim that la causa was more than a labor movement. He was often saying that it is more than a labor movement. That labor reforms were about social justice for families. And so children were symbols for that, and they themselves were participating in that. So it really kind of drives home that point. So this article also complicates our understanding of the ways that Chavez mobilized supporters. For him, no one was too young to join la causa, and the experience worked as a gateway for children to political awareness. And I found many accounts of people who were reminiscing later on, and they talked about how they were not politically aware until they were exposed to la causa and the UFW's message. And so then they became involved with that, and it led to sort of a lifetime of activism for them. So no one was too young to join la causa, and that experience was just life-changing for some children. La causa was a uniquely formative political experience for child participants, and they were central to the social justice appeal. And I'll end now with a quick story that was told to me by Karen Bithell. Hopefully what you see there is a picture of a little blonde child standing next to Cesar Chavez, and it says, "When you see lettuce, don't think of your salad, think of farm workers." So this was little Karen Bithell, and her parents supported the UFW, and from the time that she was a toddler, and so she grew up really with the UFW. Her family would drive from San Jose, California to Delano to attend union meetings and to help in any way that they could. And though she was not a farm worker, she grew up with the UFW as a constant presence in her life. And she is one of those children who signed herself your little sister, or Manita, to Chavez. And so in 1974, and this picture was actually a photo that her family included in their family Christmas cards one year with a message to support the boycott. So this is the photo that was included in the family Christmas card one year, and they were very proud of Karen. And the photo was taken at one of the union meetings. In 1974, when Karen was in 4th grade, her father would take her to the Safeway grocery store in Santa Clara, California to picket. And wearing her UFW t-shirt, she handed out flyers and urged shoppers not to shop at Safeway because they sold non-union grapes and Gallo wine. And many times people would push past her, but she doggedly implemented what Chavez taught children to do. He would take kids through the motions of picketing and standing your ground. So she would get in front of these people as they're walking into the store, and she would hold her ground, and she would say, "Don't buy those grapes and don't shop here." And she recalled that one day a lady asked her why she wasn't at home playing with her toys. She said that Karen was just too young to be doing this. And Karen yelled back at her, "There's no age limit for justice." So she very much internalized this message. And the UFW was really, still to today, she says that it made a significant impact on her life. So this is the screen that tells you where you can read the article for free. So the UC Press blog, if you go to that web address, it's sort of below middle of the screen, ucpress.edu/blog. You'll see my blog where I mentioned some of the things that I've talked about today. And then there's a link at the bottom of that page where you can go to read that article online for free. Also, if you're interested in connecting with me in other ways, you can find me online. There's my web address. And also I'm on Instagram. So thank you.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Robbins. I'll give you a collective minute to catch your breath or get a sip of water. So thanks for sharing the link. Several people asked about that. I also went to the PHR website and did see that it says free. on that particular volume issue. So I dropped that in there as well. So hopefully everybody can get access to your article. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to kind of start off. There's questions coming in through the chat function, and I will say to everybody who's still here, again, we will be posting this recording later, and also I do have a little exit survey that I'll give you at the end. But I want to lead off with a question that Daniel actually asked, one of my former students who's from Delano. So this is a great question. He says, did the participating children experience any hostility, conflicts, or resistance from other children or the community for being, part of the causa? What did that look like? And again, Daniel probably hasn't had a chance to read your article because I know you go into this. So I'd love to hear when you talk about Delano, but yeah.
Right. Definitely the kids in Delano in particular, they probably got the brunt of it. And Chavez's children, definitely. The kids were almost surrogates for their parents in the schools, especially the high schools, where, these young people are a little more aware and very, the Chavez kids went to school with the growers' kids. So there was definitely some conflict, there was some posturing, but it gave these kids, the Huelga kids, I call them the Huelga kids, the strike kids, it gave them the opportunity to stand their ground and to learn to basically, they had to every single day, it had to be difficult every single day to go to school, knowing that people could be, saying snide remarks about you or your family, your father, certainly. But there were also a lot of kids that supported them. And I found a board, it was Memories of the UFW, and they've since taken it down. This was about 5 years ago. And there were kids who grew up in Delano who were not farm workers, but they talked about knowing the kids, about knowing, about getting involved, about supporting as the kids were no longer working as much in the fields, or as they're on strike and not working at all. These kids actually were going to school a lot longer and for more continuously than farm worker kids had done in the past. And so they were becoming more involved with student politics, basically, running for office and things like that. And so that's what some of these memories talk about, supporting the kids who are running for office and for student government and things like that. So yeah, just.
No, yeah, thank you for that response. And again, I think in your article too, you even go into some of the other facilities that the kids encountered and the support systems that they built. I have a question. So I was so glad in this presentation that you included maybe some of the photos that you didn't get a chance to include in your article, and that photograph of the little girl with the UFW eagle on her skirt is amazing. I guess I'm just kind of curious, like, you talked about going to Wayne State and like digging in the archives and the gold mine. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about, the kind of wow, the surprise factor, was there anything in particular that just like, that you hadn't thought of, I guess, when you're thinking about the history of children or youth? Like, I mean, is there something that was particularly striking that you'd like to share?
Well, I think the activism part was really surprising to me. I expected there to be child labor. I did not expect to find photos of kids actually in the fields, which was amazing. And a lot of those photos were taken by UFW members in order to use them on posters and things, to let people know, look, this is what's happening. But some of them are also by local newspaper reporters, as this starts to pick up speed and, people are coming out and taking pictures. There were also kids whose parents did not go on strike. And so those kids continued to work in the fields. And so the children who were on the side of the fields picketing would yell to the other kids, come out of the fields and can join us on the picket lines. So, I think it fleshed out the experience so much more for me. And I was really surprised how many children were involved in just even clerical work in the union office, typing, how many kids were translating because their parents spoke Spanish, but the newspaper reporters spoke English, even at the union meetings, in order to reach a broader audience as more and more people came from the community. These kids are just stepping up and really doing so much. And so, that's why I really feel like this article was not anywhere on my radar when I went to Wayne State to do this research. And then when I found all this material, I was like, this has got to be, I'm going to have to write this. So
Someone's got to write it. Yeah.
yeah.
So Professor Kieran Garcha, who teaches at Cal State Bakersfield and teaches African American history, and as I recall, focuses on youth coming up within the Black Panther Party. She asks, she says, "Thank you so much for this rich, enlightening talk. How does your work approach the question of children's agency?"
Well, I think I just try to show that they were agents. They very much that I think oftentimes we discount children as being outer directed. And I found with this project that this was coming from the kids themselves. They wanted to be involved. Kids have a real sense of fairness, and social justice is, that's not fair, that this is happening. And so kids want to correct that and right that. And I know that there is some really wonderful scholarly work on African-American children in the civil rights movement and coming up. And I know that there's some work on the kids of the 68 blowouts in Los Angeles, right? But I was seeing this actually happening in Delano too, where kids are getting up and walking out of class. And so, they're not doing it because their parents are telling them that they have to do it, but they're doing it because they really want to. They feel this conviction. Many of them talked about this political awakening that they had. And then it was great to see that the parents were supporting them, because some of these kids, they were suspended from school for what they were doing. Some of the kids early on were suspended just for wearing UFW buttons and t-shirts. And their parents came in and said, this is not right, and so this movement really it just affected the whole family. And so as far as children's agency, children's are agents. I've always believed that. And so that's what I look for when I do my work.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. Going back to the letters, were most of the letters in English, or did you find any non-English letters? And if so, how did you navigate that, or did you kind of not?
No, most of the letters were in English. So there are some materials in Spanish. I read a bit of Spanish, so I just read it, get through it, look up the words I don't know. But most of the letters from the kids were English. Yeah.
Well, and the reason I was asking the question is just thinking about, like diversity of children, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the UFW was a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement. I'm just kind of, but a lot of the photos per se, maybe when you're talking about the farm labor workforce, it's mostly Mexican children, mostly, right? Because the Filipinos were the Manong. So I guess, I guess I'm thinking about the diversity of children that you're focusing on. Is it more Latino, Mexican American type children?
Well, that's a good question. Well, based on surnames, there was a mix. So there are definitely Latino children, and Latino children from California, but also from other places in the nation. But there were kids too who they didn't have Latino surnames. They were from places like Boston. They went to parochial Catholic schools. Some of them went to Jewish schools. And so there was a big diversity, I would say, quite a diversity. Karen, the little girl I talked about at the end, they're white middle-class family that were just very social justice conscious. And so there was, I think, a lot of diversity, especially in the late 60s and early 1970s.
I appreciate that. There is a question here that I'll read. It says, did working ever become a priority, I assume, for the children in this reference, over school? And if so, did that start affecting them in school as far as their attendance? Did you see any of that? I mean, you mentioned that, right? I think I assume it was the Malcriado images, but did that whole idea come into play with some of the materials that you were looking at?
Yeah, these kids, they really did feel, they felt a sense of needed to help the family. And so that was part of the whole point of getting kids out of the field if you get the kids out of the field, then maybe you can raise the wages of adults so that you don't need the family wage. Because children really did that. Many of them talked about guilt. And some of this is in interviews that I've listened to, and UC San Diego has a great collection with some online interviews and things. And, you know, they talk about this feeling of guilt that they should be a part of, you know, supporting the family. And so to leave, you know, the fact that the whole family went on strike, that made a difference. And so what I saw was actually the inverse of I think what this question is that you have guilt in the beginning, but as you leave and you're fighting for something bigger than yourself and bigger than your family, these kids started going to school more and more. They started learning more and more and realizing, I mean, a lot of those kids from that period of the late 1960s that went to Delano High School that were farm workers, they ended up going to college. First in their family to go to college. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that their families were on strike for those 4 years.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions coming in from Beth Rodacker, who teaches at Berkshire College. And one I think you actually addressed in the article. So it says, approximately how many child workers are currently working in agriculture today in the United States? Or maybe that was in your dissertation, I'm not sure.
Right. It's a tricky question. I have seen everything from 300,000 to 500,000. It depends on who's doing the survey. But it's really difficult to get an idea of how many children are out there because for a number of reasons. One is that it's seasonal work. So you don't always have kids out there all the time. It is illegal to some extent for certain ages in certain states for children to work. So it is not unheard of for children to have to hide when inspectors come around. So that makes it difficult to get a good count. And so and of course the farmers all say we don't employ kids, we employ adults, but they bring their kids with them, right? They actually employ families. So it's very, very difficult. And so at this point, and that's something I'm trying to get a better handle on, I look at numbers from, there's farm workers, there's a California Farm Worker Migrant Ministry. They have some numbers, National Child Watch, I think it is. They have some numbers, but you know, what I'm seeing right now is that a majority of the child farm labor, I believe, are undocumented children and or recent migrant families. So I don't believe it is as big a problem as it was in the 1960s. But that is where I definitely need more research. And I'm actually trying to flesh out from the 1980s on at this point. So if anyone is out there who knows of people who were kids working in the fields in the 80s and 90s, I would love to know about that. So it's a really good question, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer. And it seems to be a problem that we've had really for like the last century. And that's because the Census Bureau doesn't count kids as laborers in agriculture. So it's been very, very difficult to get official numbers.
Yeah. One sort of follow-up question she had too, and maybe this is a broader question. She says, when you think about the Delano grape strike and whatnot, the boycott, why wasn't it suggested to protest growers and owners versus consumers? And so, you know, isn't it better to go to the source with your protest? I mean, I don't know if you want to address that question. It might be beyond the scope per se of your article, but you want to go for it.
Well, the picketing on the side of the fields, that's definitely picketing the growers, right? Trying to influence them, getting them to negotiate with the union. But when you get the consumers involved, you make it so that, you know, these growers, you hit them where it really hurts. There's one thing to have people yelling at you on the side of the field, but if you can call out the police and haul these people away, it really doesn't hurt you. And that's the kind of power that these growers had in the 1960s and 1970s. But when you get the consumers to stop buying, you're hitting the bottom line. And they did start to feel it. People weren't buying lettuce and grapes. I even remember when I was a little kid, not that far past this period, thinking that it was evil to eat grapes. And it took me a long time to understand where that came from. And then as we get into, later on, people are eating grapes, and I'm like, you can't do that. So why do you go for the consumer? Because consumer boycotts do work, and they've worked many, many times in the past, over the history of, all the way back to the American Revolution, boycotting British products, So if you can cut off the reason to use that labor to make your money, right, it's going to be effective, and it was.
Yeah, and as a corollary, I'll just say to the question, it's okay to eat union lettuce or
Yes.
to eat union grapes, as long as that was harvested by workers under contract, and that was the whole point of the union. So this is great, Jennifer, Robin, Terry. This is wonderful. I'm so glad your article came out. I can't remember how I came across it. Maybe it was just in the PHR, but I might have mentioned to you that we're doing some work at La Paz and how that national monument story is told. And this article had some keen influence on the youth section and what you talk about with like Casa de la Nana and the sort of the La Paz kids and that generation. So it just hit at the right time. And so thank you for your work, and I wish you the best in all your future projects and endeavors. And again, as a reminder, we will be posting the talk on the Berkshire College Social Justice YouTube page, which is loaded with now 3 or 4 years worth of content, all related to agriculture, labor, migration to Central Valley from interdisciplinary perspectives. And so this talk is gonna make a nice roundabout with the work that's going on there. But yes, thank you again. Thanks, Jennifer, Robin. Is there anything you want to say closing, Jennifer, that I'm missing?
Thank you very much for having me here, and I can't wait to see that display at La Paz.
Yeah, for sure. It's shooting for 2027, which is the 100-year anniversary of Cesar Chavez's birth. So thank you, everybody.